Okay. Right. I want to start firstly by just saying that I would like to express my most profound gratitude and respect for the lives and works of all the great masters, sages and saints and teachers in India who have given us these extraordinary gifts for human beings to make some evolution. And I feel very presumptuous coming here to talk about meditation. So I'm not intending to focus on the metaphysical and the philosophical aspects so much of the meditation. I'm bringing some of the perspectives that people are developing from a more psychological and neuroscientific point of view that inform us, help us understand how come meditation is helping so many people all over the world. And hopefully it will give us some directions. So our morning sessions will be spent in this part of the morning like this, fairly formally, looking at some of the ideas and research. And we will have a chance to absorb that and reflect on it, because what I understand about learning from the insights of neuroscience is that we learn best when we tell somebody else about what we've learned. I know that rote learning only uses a very tiny piece of our brain, but when we are using more of ourselves and engaging and relating and feeling and doing, we create far more hardwired neural networks that will last. So that's my sort of theory. It's not just that it's easier. I think it has some sense to have a different way of reflecting on what you've taken in or thinking about it, if that's okay with you. So I'm going to start today with thinking of, how come we're here? What's the context for us to be here? We are in a very strange time in the world. It's not just that each of us might be struggling with stress. The world is presenting us with great challenge. We can't just blame our own individual vulnerabilities. We are truly in a very different situation, which is probably unique in the history of human beings. So let's just take a moment to think about the context, and then we'll be looking at some of the statistics and findings just to sort of sharpen up the drama of it in a way, and looking at just more like an overview this morning about the challenge of trying to do research on meditation and where we are. And then from today we'll be going further into more specific aspects of different kinds, where most of the research is yet established in terms of the work with mindfulness practices. So that will be the flavour of the morning sessions, and then in the afternoon I'll be inviting you to just try out some of the directions for different practices. So the chance for you to do your own research and to observe and note, and then that would be the basis for us to think about what we've learned at the end of the week, how you might compare one practice with another. And you're free, of course, to try those things out at any other point in the days we're here. So I hope that's roughly what you're here expecting to find. So if we have a look at this context, we're coming to a sort of hub, as you'll see in this diagram, where lots of different scientific disciplines and research has brought us. So we have, on the left side, you can see that the World Health Organization has been flagging up to us that we do have a global mental health crisis, that a very large number of people in the world currently are depressed, are in states of great anxiety, and unfortunately it's our children and young people who are often on the hard edge of that. Strangely enough, loneliness is being more experienced by young people than any other age group, which is quite surprising. because we may expect that more with older people. And then in the middle, we've just got the question of how can we make a sustainable existence on our planet when we don't really have enough employment opportunities for people. We have problems about climate change, resources, and a lot of political crisis and turmoil. So that's the situation that we face as human beings and that our own mental health is challenged by. Now, bringing useful research to that is all this work we're going to look at this week on meditation. And then we also have, as our colleague was indicating, the whole field of... Sorry? The positive psychology and the work on how do we keep happy. There's a lot of work on that, and an interest in resilience. From looking at what's wrong with people and how can we sort it out, we're looking more now at what works for people, what helps them cope. And this is where we come to the area of resilience. And then we've got a lot of different disciplines coming together here. We have got neuroscience, we've got psychology, we've got education, we've got health, and so on, all sharing an interest in this area. So I think it's clear from the programme. So as I mentioned, if we look at the current situation, depression being a common mental disorder and one of the main causes of disability, and it's affecting women more than men. And in the UK, you can see we've got a crisis. 1 in 4 adults will experience a mental health illness. We have a lot of negative statistics coming to us about young people. I think we're nearly down on the bottom in terms of well-being and health for young people in the more wealthier countries in the world. And we have a lot of difficulties with addictions, substance misuse, and so on. I haven't mentioned it here, but there is interesting work by Richard Wilkinson and his colleague Pickett, who are epidemiologists, and they have been looking globally at the picture that countries show us. And what comes out of their study, fascinatingly, is that as inequality increases, every measure of, if you like, dis-ease, of mental health problems, of addictions, of crime, of violence, and so on, goes up. And it's fascinating because they looked at states in America and Japan, for example, as equality evens out, those measures go down. So it's a very interesting picture they show us, and their next book has been about, well, how come this is so? What is it about extremes of inequality that lead to these outcomes? And one of their areas of looking is at the sort of psychology of dominance and how we have a subsystem within us that is attuned to trying to see where we fit in the scheme of things. You know, who's the boss, who's important, where do I fit? And as we become more unequal, the stakes are much higher, and it feels far more uncomfortable to be on the lower end of that. So there's much more sense of shame that a lot of people feel, that they haven't got the right clothes or they don't look right. And we've got, well, the whole social media element. So one of the problems they point out is that as people feel worse about themselves and they compare themselves with other people, then they tend to avoid social events and social opportunities which would help them feel less isolated. So that's one of their ideas. But I'm just mentioning that because it's important to recognise it's not just our psychology that's struggling, it's to do with the way that we're setting up life that is making it harder for everyone to feel comfortable. And we've got this very sad statistic for India about how there is one suicide every hour, and I know that in this institution there have been established many positive measures to try and support students with depression and anxiety, which is really lovely that that's happening. If anybody wants to comment, just if there's anyone got anything there to say, whether that resonates at all with you, do feel free to. Is that something you would recognise, any of those things?
Please respond.
Yeah.
Can you hear? Or?
Yeah, yeah. No, not at the moment. Okay.
We have one abhyasya.
Okay. Yeah. So we've mentioned that. So in India, it seems that they're suggesting that there are 56 million people suffering from, sounds extraordinary, and 38 from anxiety disorders. That's according to the World Health Organization. And a recent study published in the Asian Journal of Psychiatry, which was based on a survey of more than 700 students, randomly selected, almost half of them were suffering from either moderate or severe form of depression. And I think that wouldn't be so different if we asked quite a lot of teenagers in the UK, and girls particularly tend to feel very negative about how they look or how they measure up. So this was taken from the Economic Times. I don't think it's very clear on the screen. And they're looking not so much at young people, but they're looking at how people feel in their work situations. As they say, causes of stress, work, money and family are the most common sources of stress. Well, that doesn't leave much else to be stressed by, does it? And then, obviously, life-changing situations, often like parenting, pregnancy, social isolation. And nearly half of employees suffering from some kind of stress. And it's grown more severe. But it's also true that companies, and you might be able to tell me about this, are helping workers through more counselling and health awareness programs. And then you have the situation of increased urbanisation and people moving into the city and not being so close to their family. And there's another picture given to us. And I'll make these slides available so you can look more closely at them. So if you look at that satisfaction, 50% are not at all satisfied at work, which is pretty high. And 70% do not feel happy at work, and so on. Is that something you would recognise in your work situations or not? Or are you all very lucky people? You don't?
Definitely we are getting...
You do?
Yeah, definitely.
You are?
Yeah. Basically, some are, accidentally they choose this profession.
Right.
And somehow they just continue working without satisfaction.
Uh-huh.
In the middle of their employee, they start feeling that, this is not really my choice. Then they will be having family commitment, they will be having their parents' commitment. So this definitely creating a lot of chaos.
Yes, they feel trapped.
Yeah.
Feel trapped in something that they haven't got their heart in.
True.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Especially in autonomous institutions,
Mm?
work pressure will be there along with...
The work pressure.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Well, what I'm finding in my situation at home is that quite a lot of children of friends of mine, so these are people who are in their early 20s, just starting out in their jobs, are becoming really anxious and depressed because they feel overwhelmed by the stress of being assessed and measured, and somehow or other it's a new situation. They don't feel able to cope, and often they've had to sort of almost stop working and take a space. And I found that anecdotally that seems to be happening in a way that didn't used to happen. And it's also, I suppose, in the context that jobs are more precious. We haven't got the luxury of feeling there are other options sometimes. Yeah. Yeah. And then we've got this other sad, massive problem, I think, of loneliness, of people feeling isolated in many ways. And it can come in different forms, because people can have social networks. You can have teenagers feeling that they've got friends. And in fact, when we met with students yesterday here, one said, well, I have got a group of friends, but I still feel lonely. And it's something to do with the fact that they don't feel they can really be honest and be themselves. They're having to sort of present a facade, and they don't really feel they're known. They're not known in who they really are. I think that's part of what people yearn for. It's that people know me, and so that's one dimension of loneliness. Look at this, half of UK students admit to loneliness. And often people think when they're going to university, they're going to have a wonderful social time and have, and that's almost one of the expectations that then is disappointing. And they don't necessarily find people that they feel they can really be connecting with. And you've got some figures there from America. Nearly 70% of university students battle with loneliness, and 40% of foreign students have no close friends on campus. I mean, it really makes me feel very sad just to say that very starkly about how people are feeling in the world. It's really quite depressing just to hear that, isn't it? And I expect you're aware of this speech that Prime Minister Modi gave in 2017, where he wanted to alert people to this mental health problem and try to make it less of something that people find it very difficult to acknowledge or name, and saying that it really needed to be taken up. And he was particularly focused on young people's situation. So here's some more statistics. As I've mentioned, depression quite widespread. And the other problem, which you might be able to confirm, is that it's quite difficult to get help and to come forward. People feel ashamed, and they feel that they will be judged, or they'll be seen as, or they'll be pathologized. And so that makes it even worse, that it might be harder. But my sense is that people are working quite hard to change that. And for example, what's happening here, there's a lot of outreach, and people can, in the campus here, can phone 24 hours for help at any point. And so I think people are, there's a lot of effort and work going on everywhere. So when we think in a different direction, not so much about what goes wrong, because we've sort of thought about some of that, well, what is it that helps us flourish? What makes the difference? And this is where, quite usefully, some of the psychological research and development has been taking place in the last 10, 20 years, to be looking at, well, what does make us happy? What does help us sustain our lives? And this is where we come to the fact that people are revisiting what they might call the perennial philosophies, the perennial truths, the truths that last as empires rise and fall and cultures rise and fall. There are eternal truths that when we go and revisit, we can see have a wisdom that is still there for us. And it helps us to kind of be clearer about where things have become unbalanced. So we can think here that there are a convergence of different disciplines in the psychological arena that are leading us to a similar place, which will give us a psychology that is less focused on problems and pathology, which certainly in the field of psychotherapy, that's where all the emphasis used to be, was on, what is it that goes wrong? And most people who trained in psychotherapy felt worse and worse as they went on, because it's like, oh, that's probably what's wrong with me, and that's what's wrong with me, and you start feeling more and more mad and bad if you start looking at psychoanalysis, for example. So it's really heartening that we're going in an opposite direction. Somebody once said, we know a lot about endarkenment, but we don't know very much about enlightenment. That's really where we should be thinking. So from this perspective, if we take a little bird's eye view of the last, say, 30 years, we see a lot of developments in these areas. For example, in the area of cognitive psychology, it's become something that is much more holistic. It's not looking just at the cognitive elements. It's looking at the way that we can't really separate brain and body. There's an interconnected nervous system that is completely embodied. We can't just think of the brain like a kind of computer on top of us, decoding information. The brain is intrinsically immersed in throughout our whole system, including the heart, including the intestine. There are all sorts of messages being given that are telling us how we're feeling straight away about a situation. So we have to have a much more holistic, embodied view, which again is something that the great tradition of Hatha Yoga has shown us for thousands of years, that we are looking at something much more integrated. And similarly, we're looking at the fact that we are biological systems. We can't see ourselves, a human being, as separate from the environment. We are very interconnected with the environment, and our brain is being sculpted and shaped by, hello and welcome. Nice to see you. Hi. We're just sort of doing an overview and a kind of context. So we're talking about changes in the way people think about the psychology at the moment. And yeah, I was just mentioning that everything now, and from my point of view, my field of, I've been interested in qualitative research and psychotherapy, is that we're having to look at the intersubjective all the time. How we shape reality is created, by our interactions with each other in the world we live in, the language we have, the culture. We aren't separate at all. We're always influencing each other. We need to think of ourselves in the way we look at other organisms in the environment. We're interacting all the time and affected. From a historical point of view, humanistic psychology started going in the 50s, 60s and 70s, and it started affirming the more profound aspects of humanity, of the idea of having a higher self, of having a transpersonal self, and of having aspects which are much more ennobling, really, of altruism and aiming to reach our highest potential. That was one of the great ideas of the humanistic psychology movement, that everybody was motivated to achieve their highest potential. And some people who are thinking about resilience would see resilience as part of that drive from our, our more profound soul or self, that there is an aspect in us that aims to make the best of our capacities. But even going back a long, long way, there was a man called Goldstein who was a psychologist just in the 1920s, and he was working with people who had been terribly injured in the First World War, and he observed that when he looked at their recovery, that it seemed as though the whole organism was maximizing the potential that the person could reach, that there was an intrinsic organizing capacity in the human being that was making the best of the injury, which is a very interesting idea to think about, that we have that within us, beyond our consciousness at all. And then we had the way that people, when we're coming back to this, looking at transpersonal psychology and beginning to acknowledge that there were other states of consciousness. Now, it might be surprising to you being here in India, but certainly in the West in the 60s, in psychology, there was the idea that any other states of consciousness were really akin to being slightly mad or psychotic. And it took a lot of work, quite sort of clunky work, to show people, no, there are actual things of other states of consciousness. And a man called Charles Tart was very, very pioneering in establishing from a physiological point of view that these higher states could be measured. We could start using EEGs and so on. And before that, there was no objective way of saying that the way that you were experiencing a different state of consciousness could be valued or verified. So he had to do that and made a big contribution. And as I've mentioned, positive psychology. And then the other great thing that's made a difference, as some of you in the room are working on this, so it's all new, not new to you, but we've got the great advances in the technology so that we can actually look at which areas of the brain are being utilised, are being stimulated in different activities. And this has got more and more and more precise. And this is what we'll be coming back to. This has really enabled a great step forward in trying to see what is happening with meditation. And one of the problems there has been with meditation research is that it's all been rather sort of global. If you Google meditation research, you just get thousands and thousands of papers. It's completely overwhelming. And the trouble is that so many of the studies were one-offs, and they're using completely different measures. There hasn't been a replication. There hasn't been someone to objectively confirm whatever findings. It's a really difficult area. On the other hand, there's been a lot of enthusiasm, and of course so many people are practicing meditation that they really do want to show that it's made a difference. They're trying to find ways. But we'll come back to that in a moment. And another very interesting thing that made a big difference in the West was the fact that the Chinese invaded Tibet, sadly. But what that led to was the exodus of many Buddhist teachers to the West. And that coincided with, my generation, the people who are interested in consciousness and hippies and all that. And so some of these kind of young people doing psychology in those days took up the Buddhist meditation, and they started trying to integrate the insights from the teachings of Buddhist psychology with cognitive psychology. And when I did my doctoral study, because I was also an enthusiastic person for heartfulness, and I was trying to do a study on that. But when all the literature I was reading in the 1990s and the conferences I went to, I was coming across these people who were interested in showing the parallels between the maps of cognitive psychology and the construction of experience, and how they seem to correspond very well with Buddhist psychology. So this is the basis really that led to the development, the tremendous development which we're going to be looking at tomorrow, of the mindfulness practices. And I'm saying practices because it's quite a variety, and that again can be confusing. What are we actually talking about when we're talking about mindfulness? And can we compare this study with another when the participants have been doing very different things? This is the problem. So that's a very interesting outcome from the Tibet situation. And certainly there were a whole group of psychology people in UK who I've come across who would all go and do their retreats in Wales with a Buddhist teacher. And now that's interesting, borne enormous fruit, because in UK at the moment, if you went to the doctor and said you're depressed, the doctor would very likely prescribe mindfulness practice online as a remedy. because it's been shown to be equally helpful as CBT. However, it's not magic, because my husband, who works as a Samaritan, I don't know if you know about Samaritans, but we have an organisation in UK where volunteers are trained to be available 24 hours to, I mean, they don't work 24 hours, they work in shifts, but they're available to be for any person who is feeling really they need to talk to somebody. Sometimes they're feeling very extremely suicidal, sometimes they're just lonely, but they're there to support them. And so some of them say, oh, it's no good, this mindfulness stuff doesn't do it for me. But for a lot of people it has been helpful. And so I've mentioned some of this. So if we come now to thinking about resilience, I had this idea that we might all get up and do a jump, but I won't impose that on you. But I thought one of the ideas that you can have about resilience is what happens when you jump. Because if you don't bend your knees, it's very jarring. But if you can absorb the shock, you might even be able to jump higher. For those people who are dancers, you know, the more you bend your knees, the higher you jump. So that's one just clear idea we can have of resilience. How much it's about, in a way, using adversity in a positive way. But how it evolved is quite interesting, because, for example, it started with a study by, I think it's Werner and Smith. They were looking at a community where people were struggling with many severe difficulties of poverty, mental health problems with parents, perhaps alcoholism, and they were looking at what happened to the children, and they found a surprisingly high number of children, I think it was like 72 out of 200, were okay. They managed to come up to adult life and really be able to cope surprisingly well. And that was sort of confounding, you know, all this negativity, like what goes wrong with people. And sometimes you come across people in the same way in psychotherapy. You think, well, how on earth have they been able to manage so well when they've had such awful things happen? So this was a conundrum, and so they were interested in studying that more. And the origins of it, they thought it was a special aspect of the personality. There was a special trait that you could kind of identify. That's where it started. But as it's evolved, it's become something more. So it's not about only surviving, but they also thrive. So having first looked at, well, what is it that's special, the next stage of thinking was, what's the process? Is there a process people go through so when they're having to, you know, for example, a child having to deal with a real crisis in their family, is there something that goes on for them that we can map? So we can see, well, if I go through this crisis, everything falling apart, and then I seem to come together in a new, stronger way. Perhaps this is capturing something that we could then impart to people, you know, about coping. So that was another focus of interest. And then the third phase has become more about recognizing that it's a far bigger picture. That some people can be resilient in some situations and not others. You know, the fact you might have coped with one situation as a child, you might hit another one as an adult and not be able to. So this is the way. I don't know how well you can see that. This is a diagram showing the different elements. Again, it's a multidisciplinary field. It's become much more of a dynamic term at the moment. I mean, it's something that, for example, is being acknowledged and integrated a lot into schools in the UK. They've decided that this is the way to go, is to try and support children and students with resilience. So they will focus on trying to help children cope with the failures in school. So they have a whole program which is about what makes a good learner. How do you, all over the school it's like, what makes a good learner? And they're sort of indoctrinated with that. So it's not about whether you win or fail, it's how you approach your learning. And which I think is very helpful, because one of the reasons that girls often don't do so well in maths and science is because they feel very awful, they feel worse about failing than boys do, it seems. And they are more focused on trying to support children, have resources, recognise feelings, find people to talk to, and all those kinds of things. So I've just got a little diagram. I've got the different disciplines again: positive psychology, humanistic health psychology, neurobiological psychology, developmental psychopathology and traumatology. They're all feeding ideas into resilience. And for example, there is a kind of move towards supporting older people with their health, recognising often that loneliness is a core aspect of mental stress. And instead of trying to treat older people who come to the doctor with medication, they are trying to set up community-based programs of exercise and activity, because that will sort a lot of things out at once. It will give people resources, connection, more enjoyment of life. The kinds of things that help you feel more positive will have an effect on their health rather than going for medication. So it's seeping into the culture, this whole idea of resilience. So this is a picture that comes from the Overseas Development Institute, where they're looking globally from all these different perspectives. What are the things, and this is obviously including situations in the world where people are suffering great trauma after earthquakes, floods, all the things we're experiencing more with climate change, and also war, that they're trying to get a sense of what is it that will help increase and boost and support and enhance resilience in these situations. And so they have taken a kind of overall perspective here. And you'll see that, number one, on one side we've got the biggest pictures. It's about the kinds of values and the financial resources. So it depends a lot on the kinds of values that the family or the parents might have in these situations. And what the scope is for education, for care and leisure. And then the relation of the parents to the children is obviously extraordinarily powerful, because they monitor the child, give emotional support, educational support, and secure attachment, housing, and the fact that the child has a secure relationship with either of the parents. This is where we're going to hit on the weight that people are increasingly given to attachment, the studies of attachment that affect the way our brain's wired so much. But interestingly, this is where meditation comes in, because there is one researcher and practitioner called Daniel Siegel who is showing how mindfulness meditation can also help our brain with its attachment wiring. So it can actually be quite restorative to someone, which is really interesting, because attachment is about how we feel safe, secure, held, understood, known. And when we're in new situations, or when children lose contact with their parents, this is what is really undermined. It's a very core aspect of our well-being, and has a huge impact on everything. So this is if somebody's had a good enough attachment experience, that will really help them in their resilience in later life. And then we learn coping. And you probably can think about your own family, perhaps later this morning. Think about your own family's stories, your own stories, and where we get inspiration from. How do we cope? How did our grandparents cope? How did our ancestors cope with very difficult life situations? How much are those stories available in our family to support us? We can think, well, I can think, well, during the war, my parents did this. This is how they managed. I've got some reference. So that all those kinds of things are things that we draw on when we're feeling under stress. And then teachers and peers, that can make so much difference. I mean, it's not obvious. It's very obvious that can make a big difference. If someone is able to be in a work situation and they're feeling stressed, and they're actually able to say that to somebody around them, and somebody can be more empathic and listening, that will make a huge difference compared with if they go to work and they're terrified that anybody's going to find out there's anything wrong with them, which I think is true for a lot of people. But that adds to the anxiety. Whereas if the person feels safe to be themselves, safe to have people know that they're having a bit of a difficulty, it can make a huge difference. And I know that from more close experience in my family, that the more sympathetic that employers and managers and colleagues can make an enormous difference. And similarly in the family. So we're all being asked in this climate to help with resilience. We can all contribute to the resilience of everyone if we are a little bit more sensitive. And it takes a step, because most people feel they have to appear strong and in charge of life. And it's a big step to say, actually, I'm not feeling strong and wonderful and in command. And I still have got my capacities, but I'm not feeling quite as confident today. Now, has anybody here in this room ever not started out in the day feeling not as confident as they would like to be? I mean, we've all been in that situation. It's a common human one. So I think it's an invitation to us to be helpful. And then we've got, when we look at some of the most inspiring examples of children who managed to overcome enormous odds. I mean, there must be loads and loads of people here in this country and elsewhere, but who've overcome enormous odds to get somewhere in life. One of the key things is perseverance. And so that perseverance is going to really need a lot of support from others. Because the whole problem is that it's not easily solved. It's like one step and then another step. One of the people who's written about their own struggle is a person called James Doty, who has been very, very influential in compassion-based. He started an institution in America to cultivate compassion. And he is an example. He came from a family where his father was alcoholic, his mother was severely depressed and suicidal, and he was really, as you could imagine, quite wild and lost as a child. And it's got this extraordinary story because he went into a magic shop, a shop that sold magic things, and there was the mother of the owner looking after the shop, and she looked at this James Doty and somehow was able to kind of see him more from an inside place. And she said, "Oh, I think I can help you." And she offered him the steps to loving kindness, mindfulness, meditation. And he did it. He did it. And in his own story, this helped him cope. It helped him focus. And he, eventually became a doctor, and he's a very significant person in the world, very It's quite extraordinary. She gave him these tools, and as a child he was able to catch them and stick to them. So it's a nice book to read.
What's the name of the book?
Oh, I'll find it. It's something I've got it somewhere. I'll look at it. Yeah, it's something like Into the Magic Shop or something. It's just something like that. I've got it. I've got a bit here. I'll put it out.
James R. Doty.
James Doty. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's just something overall about resilience, and now we'll come to a little bit about the whole issues of meditation and research. And some of you have been involved in this. You do chip in and tell me about your how you've coped with the problems with meditation and research. So this is one of the, where we start from when we're looking at meditation is, what exactly are you measuring? What is it you would want to measure, and how would you measure it?
Happiness.
Happiness? Okay. So how would you do that?
Peace.
Peace, yeah. So the simplest way to do that is in a qualitative way, where we can just ask people, how do you feel? And they say, I feel happy and peaceful. But from the scientific community's point of view, that might not stand up very well, because they'd say, well, how do you know that it's due to the meditating? Perhaps they just had a strong cup of coffee, because that always makes me feel happier. So but we had to start somewhere. So certainly I think initially people were really wanting reports of the kinds of things that people felt after meditating. But then how could that be matched with trying to look objectively, trying to measure something else? Does something happen in your brain? So the early started out with the EEG tests, and they put them on people. And the other thing is to remember that in the 1970s and 80s, when a lot of these things were getting going on the West point of view, the standard subject for any research was students, because students want to earn money and they're available. But they're not exactly the longest meditators in the world. So a lot of the research was carried out on people who'd just, done a very short amount of meditation, not like real practitioners. So again, what does that show? And then the other problem is that some people can be doing exactly the same practice as somebody else, but they won't show the same measures. This is a real conundrum. I was reading about a situation. There's a man called Harald Wallach in Germany who does a lot of research on meditation. And he was saying there were these two nuns. They came from very similar backgrounds. They were practicing the same practice. They had the same teaching, all that. They measured them, and their brainwaves were completely different. It was a completely different map. So it's really difficult to find objective things that match with the subjective account. So that's one of the challenges which people are overcoming, I think, more and more. And the other problem has been that it's just been such a wide field. I mean, there are so many different practices. There are so many different things that are about how changing consciousness. There are some things that are more at the relaxation end, and there are some things that are very far away from that, but they're all in the same field. And very often people have created measures, but they've only been used on one set of participants or one kind of research exercise. They haven't been replicated. You can't compare them with each other. So it's a real jumble. It has been. And as I was mentioning, one of the key things is that people have recognised that there are different states of consciousness. And this was one of the earlier things, that you could look at changes in the brainwave patterns. And you can look at alpha waves, beta waves, delta waves, gamma waves, and realise that we can map certain subjective accounts with objective measures of brain waves. So that's really where it started and has been developing from. And then earlier on, and this is changing, people wanted to find a way of sorting out what's the main differences between meditation, and they decided, in some ways, and it perhaps wasn't so accurate, was that you could sort of look at a lot of the Buddhist kind of practices as cultivating a focus of attention. It's witnessing, being present in a very open way to what is, as opposed to concentrative ones where you're really focusing attention on one thing. And they have different outcomes. For example, one study was showing if you really focus your attention on something, you sort of merge with it. You sort of become one with it. That tends to happen. Whereas if you're witnessing, you tend to keep a different perspective. So that was one rather simplistic way of thinking about dividing different meditations into sets and then seeing that perhaps slightly different things happened in your brain according to whether you're doing one or the other. However, it does get much more complex than that because, in fact, within practices like Buddhism, there are probably both going on. We can say in heartfulness practices there are both. It is not necessarily solving our problem. And so we're getting, and we're coming to this tomorrow, that a different way of thinking about them, which is, I think, quite helpful, talking about deconstructive and constructive, but I'll explain that. I don't think I'm going to talk an awful lot about that because we're coming up to time, but if you're interested, these are the, if you're looking at the history of meditation research, these are some very significant names. The TM, Transcendental Meditation people, really have done an enormous amount of research. And, for example, they've shown that if a certain number of people in a place are meditating, it seems to correlate with a decrease in crime, for example. And they've shown a lot of changes in the brain. They used a lot of measures. However, as I mentioned earlier, the problem is now that people are being more rigorous and they're saying, oh ho, that's all very well, but it's TM people doing the research. So if we're really trying to be objective, we can't take that as being as reliable as if somebody from an independent research organisation had done the same research. So they are, I think, trying to address that. And Herbert Benson is known because quite early on he decided that you could look at the sorts of things that happen in meditation as a whole set of a kind of relaxation process. And so some people have been interested in looking at what's the difference between the relaxation that does happen with meditation, on its own, as opposed to what happens with what's the meditative bit, not the relaxation bit. And then you may be familiar with, have you heard of Jon Kabat-Zinn? He is the main contributor really to the whole evolution of the mindfulness research. And why that, I think, has been so successful in influencing people and influencing health service is because it's given some very replicable instructions. So it's given a way of offering researchers a standardized protocol in lots of different situations so that comparisons can be made with this group, with that group, and so on, because they've all done the same thing in the same situation, more or less. I mean, there's different varieties of that. But interestingly, if you look more closely, as we'll see tomorrow, with some of the practices that he developed, he included, in a way, a yoga element in the MBCT, which is more of a mix of things, actually, which isn't always acknowledged. And so this is also one of the problems about the research, is that it's already got a mix of influences that's going to change the outcome. Yes, yes, we'll look at it tomorrow. It's mindful-based cognitive therapy, yeah.
I'm not sure if you have some doubts, you must always
Yes,
ask
please
them.
do.
Put up your hand
Chat
and
me
ask.
up. Yeah. I mean, I'm giving you these names because if any of you is interested to find out more or are involved in research, then you could look at these people and their work.
And we have actually, ma'am, two research scholars from the psychology discipline in humanities and social sciences. One is here, Ms. Kalyani Biswal,
Very welcome.
research scholar
Yeah.
in psychology, clinical psychology.
Oh well, do come in because I'm not a clinical psychologist at all, as you'll see. So do feel with all your expertise. Hello,
Regents
welcome.
Shankar Paniteri.
Very welcome. Just
You're
do
working on?
do say you've got it wrong. Anyway, I won't go into those. If you want to know more, you can. You've probably heard of Daniel Goleman and Ken Wilber. I don't know if you've come across his work. He was trying to integrate the whole body of everything into an overall system of human evolution. And then, of course, there's been a lot of research in India, and I'm not very familiar with that, but that's one example. So this is the work that has led up to where we are. And we're now in this situation where we're going from the more simplistic to much more sophisticated ways of looking at changes in the brain. There's an example there I'm going to show you next. And we can map now what's going on in the brain and how it's changing. And this is where we've got, as I've mentioned, this very large body of research. So that's an interesting picture, isn't it? So the colours are obviously showing the activity in the brain on the left. This is before and after a 10-minute meditation, how the brain has altered its activity to something looks much calmer, doesn't it? Just say on the right. There's a more. So I'm sorry that I'll circulate these slides. So these are just some general things. We're going to look more closely. So I'll read it out as it's rather small writing. MRI scans show meditation increases gyrification or cortical folding, which allows the brain to process information further. Now, as far as I know, Sarah Lazar, who's a well-known researcher, and she did her research actually on yoga meditation, and she found this thickening of the brain. But Richard Davidson, in his book, The Science of Meditation, which we'll be looking at, says that when they tried to see if that could be replicated, it wasn't. So he was saying, at the moment it's not as... I don't know if I'm sure there's other research which has shown that thickening, but I don't know the source of that. So then we've got brain function. Meditation increases whole brain function by synchronizing right and left hemispheres, increasing balance and amplitude in alpha, beta and delta brainwave patterns. It improves focus by causing an increase in cortical thickness again, which is the area in areas of the brain responsible for attention. And it increases the dopamine and serotonin levels, which are associated with happiness and positivity. So it's mood. Meditation decreases stress and anxiety by down-regulating the sympathetic system, cortical and adrenaline, creating a state of deep relaxation in which our deep breathing, pulse, blood pressure and metabolism are decreased. And then it also improves cognitive function. We've shown that with mindfulness and the capacity to sustain attention. And that increases, again, grey matter in the brain and brain volume and cerebral blood flow. Now you'll find all these lists of things that do change with meditation. It's just that some of those are more solid than others in terms of the base of them. So I think we're nearly finished. I'm just going to, come to one more. So just to go back to our earlier thoughts about what makes the whole difference, this is a little summary of the contribution from Richard Davidson, because he has really been someone who's started out, he was one of the first people to use EEGs to go and look at Tibetan meditators in the Himalayas in the 1980s and 90s. And so he's gone on from there. He also does his own practice. And he's putting forward these notions about how well-being is created or supported. All of this is based on his examination of what the research shows us. So he's defining resilience as the rapidity with which we recover from adversity. Now you can see that if you're doing something like mindfulness, where you're asked to pay attention and as your mind wanders you bring it back, one of the payoffs for that is that people find that they can put their attention, they're exposed in their test to some awful image of some awful industrial injury. And they find that those people who've done more mindfulness meditation can come back to a state of balance more quickly than those who haven't. So that can translate in life to a capacity to find balance more quickly than those who haven't done it. And the fact, of course, you recover quicker, it does help you feel better, and it shows how we can modulate our brain wiring, but it does take time. It's not a quick thing to develop that capacity. And that's another thing we need to think about, is how long have people meditated to see some of these outcomes. So he's suggesting you have to do 6,000 to 7,000 hours to have that as a permanent trait. You might have it as a short-term state, but to make it permanent. And then the capacity to see the positive, to see the goodness in people. If you're depressed, that's very difficult. You tend to see things in a very dark way. But I think this is one of the best. This is one of the most positive things that I think comes out of this research, is that even a short time of doing a loving kindness practice changes mood. It's really wonderful that you can alter your whole focus quite quickly, and also make you feel happier. The other thing he says is that it's been shown, they did a study where they phoned everybody up and said, what are you thinking about? And they found that, most people, we've got our phones out, we're all over the place. But it also relates to not feeling very well. When you've got your attention more in the present moment, you are going to feel happier than if you're all over the place with your awareness. So that confirms a probably age-old wisdom that a wandering mind is not a happy one. So that's another outcome of meditation, that the more in the present you are, the more you're going to feel happy. And it's true. I mean, I think it is a way, I don't know if you've tried that, that sometimes the best way to cope with any difficulty is just to be completely immersed in the present moment and be there, be here now. And then we've got generosity. Now this is a lovely finding, that we are going to feel much better when we're doing something generous. It's one of the shortcuts to well-being, is to do something on behalf of others. So the other great thing, which I haven't mentioned, which is very, very important, is that until the 70s and 80s, maybe it's even later, people used to think that, the way you came into life was more or less fixed. The way your brain was configured, that was it. And all of this work that's come about in the last 20 years, 30 years, has shown that actually that's not the case at all. That our brain is very, very plastic. It's moulded by experience. For example, they find that taxi drivers in London who have to learn, it's called the knowledge. And in order to become an official taxi driver of those black cabs, you have to learn all the roads and all the routes of London. And it takes about 3 or 4 years, and you have to go around on a motorbike. It's really hard work. But they find when they look at the brains of taxi drivers, they've actually got a whole different bit of brain that other people don't, that's been created by that. And there's all sorts of examples of that. So, our brains are responding. This is where we're all whatever we're involved in life and world and relationship, our brain is moulding and changing, which is very hopeful. It's very hopeful because it means that we have the capacity to change. So I think that's okay, we'll stop there. Shall we have a break now then?
Yeah, just I wanted to mention one thing, that if you are interested, you can look at David Eagleman, The Brain. There are 6 lectures, David Eagleman. Have you heard? It's very good on the brain.
শুরু করে দাও
The Brain. 6 1-hour videos.
Look a little bit at the brain a bit tomorrow as well. We'll try and understand it because
The Brain, David Eagleman.
Uh,
E-G-L-E-M-A.
yeah.
And if any participant has any doubt